Welcome.
Let us take a moment before we begin to acknowledge where you are right now. You are safe. You are held by the gravity of the earth. The day is done. The noise of the present, the demands, the notifications, the endless stream of information has ceased. Tonight, we are not looking for excitement. We are not looking for the spark of adrenaline. We are looking for the slow, heavy rhythm of the past. We are going to drift back to a time when the world moved at the speed of a walking horse, when the night was truly dark, and when life was governed not by clocks, but by the rising and setting of the sun. We are going to explore a very specific kind of history tonight. It is not the history of glorious battles or shiny crowns. It is the history of the ordinary, the history of the soil, the water, and the fire. But there is a weight to this story. It is the story of how the things that were once free, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the fire that warms us, were slowly, methodically, and cynically enclosed by those with power. As you listen to the burdens of the medieval peasant or the heavy armor of the Roman soldier, I invite you to feel the contrast with your own body right now. While they carry the weight of unjust taxes and physical toil, you are free to let go. You do not have to pay a lord for the warmth of your blanket. You do not have to pay a toll to close your eyes. So, let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. Imagine a heavy velvet curtain being drawn across the window of your mind, shutting out the modern world. Let us travel back to the year 1140 AD, to a small, nameless village in Europe. The air smells of wood smoke, wet wool, and damp earth. It is a quiet world, but it is a world on the brink of a silent catastrophe. This is the story of how we lost the commons. This is the story of how the world was sold. Section I. The enclosure of the earth. Before the invention of complex tax codes, before the endless paperwork of modern bureaucracy, and before the concept of intellectual property, there was simply the earth and its resources. For the medieval peasant, life was hard. It was a cycle of labor that began before dawn and ended after dusk. But within that hardship, there were pockets of communal survival. There were institutions that belonged to no one and therefore belonged to everyone. Chief among these was the communal bread oven. I want you to imagine the sensory experience of this place. It is a cold morning in November. The frost lies heavy on the thatched roofs of the village. The mud of the road is frozen solid, crunching beneath your thin leather boots as you walk. You are carrying something precious in your arms, a sad, pale ball of dough. It is not much. It is made from grain you grew yourself, grain that you fought the birds and the weather to harvest. It represents hours of labor, grinding and kneading until your arms ached. As you approach the center of the village, the air changes. The biting cold of the morning recedes. You can smell it before you see it. The deep, rich aroma of yeast, of toasted wheat, and the sharp tang of burning oak. The communal oven was a massive structure, built of stone and clay, looking as if it had grown out of the ground. It looked older than time itself. It was the heart of the village. Here, there were no fees. There were no guards. There were no lists of rules nailed to the door. You would step inside the shelter of the oven's roof. You would nod to your neighbor, who was standing there with their own slightly sadder ball of dough. you would place your loaves together in the heat. For a few moments, as the bread baked, you were not a serf. You were not a subject. You were just a human being, sharing the ancient alchemy of fire and grain. There was the faint smell of soot, the warmth on your face, and the faint smell of hope. It was a simple system. It relied on a mutual understanding that some things, like the ability to cook food, were natural rights. But peace, in the history of humanity, is often just a pause between inventions of exploitation. Somewhere in a castle on a hill overlooking this village, a man woke up. He was the local lord. He was a man whose soft hands had never held a plow, and whose mind was burdened not by survival, but by greed. One morning, he sensed something that alarmed him. He sensed joy within his territory. Perhaps he heard a peasant laughing near the oven. Perhaps he saw smoke rising and realized that heat was being generated without his permission. He realized that his tenants were content, and to a feudal lord, contentment was a dangerous commodity. Contentment meant they weren't working hard enough for him. He stormed into the village square. He rode a horse that cost more than the collective lifetime earnings of everyone in the village. He stared at the old stone oven with cold, calculating eyes. He looked at it as if it owed him rent. And then he spoke the words that would change the structure of society forever. "This belongs to me now," he declared with the absolute confidence of a man backed by swords. "If you want bread, pay me." Let us pause and really feel the absurdity of this moment. Imagine being a starving farmer in the year 1140. You are holding your dough, you are hungry, and you are listening to a man explain to you that heat, the transfer of thermal energy from fire to food, is now a luxury service. The peasants blinked at him in confusion. They looked like chickens watching someone build a trebuchet, utterly baffled by the mechanics of their own destruction. One brave soul whispered, "But my lord, the oven belongs to the community." The Lord smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator who has just realized the fence is open. "Not anymore," he said. Suddenly, the act of baking, a fundamental necessity for human life, became a premium experience. The rules changed instantly. No coin, no bread. If you could not pay the fee, you did not eat. The Lord had essentially unlocked the achievement of medieval intermittent fasting for the entire village, permanently. Now, the human spirit is resilient. When faced with a wall, we try to dig under it. Some rebels in the village tried to bypass this new tyranny. They thought, "I will simply bake my bread at home." But consider the architecture of a medieval home. It was built of wattle and daub, straw and timber. It was, essentially, a flammable suggestion of a house. It was a pile of kindling waiting for a spark. Attempting to bake bread in an open hearth inside such a house was suicidal. One spark from the dough, one slip of the peel, and the entire neighborhood would ignite like it was auditioning to be Mordor. The Lord knew this. He knew physics was on his side. Even attempting self-sufficiency became a speed run to arson. And so, the monopoly was absolute. The Lord took advantage of this trap with ruthless efficiency. He introduced a menu of fees that would make a modern airline jealous. If the oven burned your bread because the attendant was careless, you paid a fee for wasting the heat. If you burned the oven, a bigger fee. If you complained about the burnt bread, that was an insolence fee. Even waiting in line became a hazard. If you breathed too loudly while waiting for your turn, there might be an unspecified fee that changed daily depending on the Lord's mood. The communal oven, once the warm heart of the village, transformed. It became the medieval equivalent of the Department of Motor Vehicles. Long lines, slow service, sullen guards, and one man in charge who clearly hated everyone. The peasants adjusted. They had no choice. They stood in line, clutching their coins, shivering in the cold. They engaged in the only form of resistance left to them, quiet resentment. They muttered insults under their breath, creative, earthy insults. "May a goat sneeze on his stew," they would whisper. "May his boots get wet and stay wet forever." But beneath the insults, there was fear, because deep down, they understood the truth. This was only the beginning. The oven was just the first domino. If a lord could claim ownership of the heat inside a stone dome, what else could he claim? Could he charge for walking? Could he charge for existing? Could he charge you for looking at birds the wrong way? As the smoke rose from the Lord's privatized oven, drifting up into the gray sky, the peasants realized that medieval Europe had entered its villain arc. The world was closing in. Leave the village square now. Let the smell of burnt bread fade. Walk with me down the muddy path, past the fields, until we reach the riverbank. Before medieval lords figured out how to charge for sunlight and personal happiness, rivers were the one thing peasants could count on. Water is fluid. It is elusive. It slips through fingers. How could anyone own it? For centuries, the river was the community lifeline. It was a chaotic, open access system. You drank from it. You washed your clothes in it, scrubbing the wool against the rocks. You dumped questionable things into it and pretended not to see your neighbor doing the same downstream. It flowed freely. Fish swam peacefully in the currents, unaware of the concept of property law. The only thing dangerous about rivers was the risk of drowning, which, frankly, was still a better fate than a meeting with your landlord. It was perfect for people who had zero money, zero rights, and zero energy left. But the eyes of the nobility are always scanning the horizon for things that are free in order to make them expensive. One afternoon, a nobleman rode his horse to the edge of the water. He watched the river flow. He watched the peasants filling their buckets. He stared at the water like it had personally insulted his boots. And he declared, "This shall now be taxed." Imagine the shock of the peasant standing knee-deep in the mud, holding a bucket. They froze like medieval deer in torchlight. "Taxed, my lord?" they might have stammered. "But the river moves." "Yes," the Lord replied, watching the current swirl, "and now it moves for me." This is how river tolls were born. It was the medieval equivalent of charging people for the passage of time. The Lord ordered the construction of wooden toll bridges. Now, a bridge can be a useful thing, but these lords built bridges even across shallow streams. Streams that a child could wade through without getting their knees wet. Why build a bridge where one isn't needed? To create a choke point. If you tried to wade across the stream to save a coin, you were not just being frugal. You were committing a crime. You had just committed toll evasion. This was a serious offense. It was punishable by fines. Or, if the guard on duty was bored and feeling creative, it might be punishable by a quick drowning demonstration. The peasants tried to argue using logic and theology. "But the river belongs to God," they cried. "Yes," the Lord agreed, nodding piously. "And God gave me permission. Now pay." The injustice went deeper than just the money. It was the lack of reciprocity. In a modern society, we pay taxes with the expectation, however often disappointed, that the government will maintain the infrastructure. But medieval lords didn't clean the rivers. They didn't dredge the silt. They didn't reinforce the banks. They didn't even know how rivers worked. These were the kind of men who believed water flowed downhill solely out of respect for their authority. And yet, they taxed it. Some areas got creative with their extortion. It wasn't just a crossing fee. They introduced drinking fees, a hydration tax. They introduced fishing fees, a fish theft tax. They introduced viewing fees. Yes, a scenic observation fee. If you stood on the bank and looked at the water too long, enjoying the way the light hit the ripples, you were consuming the Lord's scenery. That would be 2 coppers, please. One village reached the absolute peak of absurdity. They charged people for letting their livestock think about crossing the river. Imagine a cow standing on the muddy bank. It is chewing cud. It is staring blankly at the other side, as cows do. To the peasant, the cow is just confused. To the tax collector, that cow is contemplating the stream, and that contemplation is a taxable event. By the end of the century, rivers that had existed peacefully for millions of years had been transformed. They were no longer wild entities. They had become medieval ATMs. Except, instead of giving you money, these ATMs reached out and took it from you. All because one man looked at the water and thought, "How do I make this worse?" The enclosure of the water was complete, but the Lord's hunger for control was not satisfied. He looked from the river to the fields, and then he looked into the peasant's own home. He heard a sound coming from the cottages, a grinding sound, and he knew with certainty that he had to stop it. Let us move now from the riverbank, away from the watchful eyes of the toll collectors, and retreat into the perceived safety of the home. The medieval cottage was small. It was drafty. The floor was packed earth, which turned to mud when the roof leaked, which was often. But it was private, or at least the peasants believed it to be. Inside these walls, for generations, there existed a sound. It was the background noise of survival. It was the sound of the hand mill. Every family owned one. It was not a complex machine. It consisted of 2 heavy stones, usually circular. The bottom stone remained stationary, while the top stone was turned by hand using a wooden handle. You would pour the grain you had harvested with your own hands, grain that still smelled of the field and the sun, into the hole in the center. Then you would turn. It required arm strength. It was monotonous work. It took hours to grind enough flour for a day's bread. But there was a dignity in it. The hand mill represented self-sufficiency. It was a tool of independence. As long as you had your stones and your grain, You could feed your family. You did not need to ask for permission. You did not need to pay a fee. It was free, and in the Middle Ages, free was a dangerous concept. This rhythmic scraping sound, sh, clack, was the heartbeat of the village. It was the sound of people taking care of themselves. But the lord of the manor had very sharp ears. He was a man who likely couldn't identify a wheat stalk if you smacked him with it. He did not understand the labor of the harvest, but he understood one thing perfectly: leverage. One morning, the Lord rode through his lands. He heard that scraping sound drifting from the open windows and cracks in the cottage walls. To the peasant, that was the sound of dinner preparation. To the Lord, that was the sound of a leak in his bank account. Every rotation of a hand mill was a rotation that was not happening at his mill. It was lost revenue. And so, he made a decision that defies the logic of modern capitalism, but fits perfectly into the logic of feudalism. He did not improve his own services to compete. He simply banned the competition. He rode into the village square, pointed dramatically at the invisible enemy inside the cottages, and declared, "These hand mills are now illegal." Just like that, the tools that peasants had used for generations became contraband. Owning two rocks that fit together was suddenly the medieval equivalent of running an illicit underground operation. The Lord declared a milling monopoly. He built a massive watermill or windmill on his estate, and he mandated that every single grain of wheat grown on his land must be ground at his mill. This was the soke, right, the right to force people to use your facilities at a price you set. Imagine the frustration. You have a perfectly good mill at home. It works. It is free. But now you are forced to pack your grain into heavy sacks. You have to hoist them onto your back or load them onto a donkey if you are lucky enough to own one. You have to trudge miles to the Lord's mill. And when you arrive, you do not find a customer service representative waiting to help you. You find a crowd. You wait behind 20 other miserable people. You wait in the rain. You wait in the mud. The Lord's mill was often operated by a man, the miller, who was a figure of intense suspicion in medieval folklore. The miller was the Lord's agent. He was often portrayed as a man with golden thumbs, meaning he pressed his thumb on the scale to cheat the weight. He definitely didn't wash his hands. He judged your grain quality with a sneer. The process of the transaction was a series of insults. First, you waited. Then you paid a fee to have your grain ground. Then you watched as the miller took a portion of the flour for himself, the mulcher. He would often take the best handfuls, claiming it was his due. Then, if he felt like it, he might charge a second fee. You would return home hours later, exhausted, with less flour than you started with, and significantly less will to live. And the worst part? The Lord's mill didn't even work well. Medieval engineering was optimistic. The Lord's mill broke often. It got stuck, it flooded. In the winter, the water wheel froze. In the summer, if the river was low, it wouldn't turn. Sometimes, because nobody really understood physics yet, the friction would cause the flour dust to ignite, and the whole thing would randomly explode. But the peasants had no choice. Whether the mill functioned or not, the fee remained consistent. This was medieval innovation at its finest. Take something that works and is free, make it worse, charge money for it, and call it progress. Naturally, people tried to resist. They were desperate. They went back to their hand mills. They ground grain in secret, late at night, trying to muffle the sound of the stones with blankets. But the Lord had anticipated this. He employed men, mill inspectors. These were the medieval equivalent of a SWAT team for baking ingredients. They would raid cottages. They would burst in, searching for the telltale round stones. If they caught you, they didn't just find you, they confiscated your stones. They would drag them outside and smash them. If they caught you twice, they would destroy the millstones completely. Breaking a rock seems like a petty punishment. But remember, these stones were heavy. They were valuable. Breaking them was a public tantrum. It was a symbolic act of dominance. One lord, in a moment of terrifying honesty, wrote in his court records, "The peasants must not grind grain themselves, for independence breeds arrogance." He meant, I cannot monetize them if they are capable of surviving on their own. So the stones were broken. The sound of the hand mill faded from the village, replaced by the distant, grinding roar of the Lord's monopoly. The rhythm of the home was broken, and the dependence on the master was sealed. If the home was violated and the river was taxed, perhaps the peasant could turn to the wild. Surely the forest belonged to God. For centuries, the forest was the medieval peasant's emotional support system. It was the source of everything they needed to survive the crushing weight of feudalism. If you were cold, firewood. If you were hungry, roots, berries, mushrooms, and perhaps a rabbit if you were quick enough. If you were sad, a quiet place to cry behind a barn. Firewood, in particular, was life. In a world without insulation, without central heating, and with winters that froze the ink in the scribe's pot, wood was the difference between waking up and freezing to death. For generations, collecting wood was simple. It fell off the trees naturally. God supplied it. Gravity did the delivery work. You walked into the woods, picked up what had fallen, and walked home. No middleman, no paperwork. But then the enclosure of the mind began. One crisp morning, the local baron rode through his forest. He was a man who possessed the economic instincts of a parking meter with legs. He spotted a peasant bending over to pick up a stick, a single, pathetic, rotting stick, a stick that probably wouldn't even burn well. To the peasant, this was survival. To the baron, this was theft. His mind began to vibrate with profit-driven rage. He looked at the vast, chaotic floor of the forest, covered in millions of twigs, branches, and logs, and he had a revelation. What if I owned every single stick in this forest? From that moment on, the forest changed. It ceased to be a natural ecosystem and became a warehouse of inventory. Proclamations were nailed to trees. The woods were declared protected royal timberland, or simply the Lord's private preserve. I am now charging money for something I didn't know existed until 7 minutes ago. The peasants were stunned. How could anyone own fallen wood? The trees didn't sign contracts. The wind that knocked the branches down didn't work for the baron. But in the Middle Ages, ownership wasn't about logic. It was about who had the fanciest boots and the least empathy. The new rules were brutal. Collecting firewood now required a permit. You had to pay a fee to enter the woods. The fee was often calculated to be just affordable enough to keep you alive, but expensive enough to keep you poor. A fee the size of your soul. Peasants would trudge into the forest with these permits dangling from their belts like sad ornaments. They walked in fear. The woods were no longer safe. They were patrolled by the Baron's guards, men who lurked behind trees, waiting to jump out and yell things like, "Drop the stick, criminal!" Imagine the absurdity of being arrested for holding a twig. If a peasant accidentally picked up a branch that was too fresh, one that had perhaps green leaves on it, they were accused of cutting live wood. This was a serious crime. The punishments were disproportionate. You could be fined, you could be whipped, you could be imprisoned. It was as if the Baron believed he was avenging a fallen family member rather than a piece of oak. So, the peasants adapted. They became creatures of the night. They began collecting firewood illegally. They would wait until the moon was hidden by clouds. They would sneak into the forest, tiptoeing through the dry leaves like underpaid ninjas. Every step was a risk. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot in the silence. They gripped their bundles of wood as if they were stealing the crown jewels, terrified that an owl's hoot was a guard signal. Meanwhile, the Baron slept peacefully in his warm manor, dreaming of new ways to charge people for oxygen. But the enclosure of the forest was not just about wood. It was about the animals. The king's deer. In the modern world, if you see a deer, you might think it is cute. In the medieval world, a deer was a walking political statement. The lords and kings discovered that they enjoyed hunting, but they didn't enjoy it as a way to get food. They enjoyed it as a performance. They enjoyed the riding, the trumpets, the costumes. They declared vast swaths of forests as royal forests. This title sounded majestic. It actually meant nobody else is allowed to use this. The forest was transformed into a sacred, untouchable sanctuary reserved exclusively for the nobility's hobbies. The king's deer became more valuable than the peasant's life. If a peasant killed a deer to feed his starving family, it was treated with the same seriousness as treason. In some places, poaching a deer was punishable by death. Killing a peasant, on the other hand, was often just punishable by a fine, an inconvenience fee. King, deer, pheasant, peasant. If a noble ran you over with his horse while he was chasing a fox, you were expected to apologize for damaging his horse's hooves with your ribs. The injustice was loud. The peasants lived in silence, trying not to disturb the game. But the royal hunting parties were a cacophony. 100 nobles would flood the forest. Trumpets blaring, horses stamping, dogs barking like they were unionized. They would tear through the undergrowth, scaring away every animal within 10 miles. They trampled crops, they broke fences. And after they had ruined the ecosystem for the day, they would declare the forest overused and ban the peasants even harder. The forest, once a place of freedom, a spa retreat for the poor, had become a gated community. The trees didn't change, the moss didn't change, but the laws wrapped around them like barbed wire. With the stroke of a quill, nature itself had been privatized. And the peasant, cold and hungry, looked up at the sky. Surely the rain was free. Surely the clouds belonged to no one. But as he looked up, he saw the Lord's tax collector standing by his rain barrel holding a ledger. And he knew that even the weather was about to receive an invoice. We move now to the elements themselves. We have seen the fire of the oven enclosed. We have seen the water of the river taxed. We have seen the wood of the forest claimed. But surely there were limits. Surely the Lord of the manor, in all his arrogance, could not claim ownership of the weather. Rain was one of the few dependable blessings in the medieval world. It was the only thing that fell from the sky without charging interest. It watered the crops, it refilled the streams, it washed the dust from the air. For the peasant, rain was a utility provided by God. It was free, and in the logic of medieval Europe, if something was free, it was living on borrowed time. The trouble began, as it always did, with a view from a window. Here in my manor, warm, dry, looking out through the thick glass, or perhaps just an open shutter at his estate. He sees the rain falling. He sees it soaking into his fields. But then his eyes drift to the village. He notices the roofs of the peasant cottages glistening with fresh water. He sees barrels placed under the eaves catching the runoff. He sees buckets filling up. And he feels a deep, unnatural anger. To you and me, that water is nature. To the Lord, that water was a resource that was bypassing his ledger. In his mind, water falling on his land was exactly the same as water belonging to him personally. He felt that nature had dared to supply hydration to his tenants without consulting him first. So he sat down at his desk, he dipped his quill in ink, and he announced a new rule with the confidence of a man who had never understood physics. All rain that touches my estate is mine. The proclamation was read in the village square, likely in the pouring rain, which added a certain grim irony to the proceedings. The peasants, drenched and confused, tried to wrap their heads around this revelation. They looked up at the sky. To their knowledge, the clouds were not part of the Lord's estate. The clouds did not pay rent. They did not attend feudal ceremonies. The sky simply existed above everyone, aggressively neutral. But the Lord was unmoved by meteorology. The new law was simple. If rain touched your bucket, your barrel, your roof, or even your head, you were expected to pay a small fee for unauthorized water collection. Think about that phrasing. Unauthorized water collection. In other words, water falling onto your face was now technically a crime. The peasants tried to argue. They pointed at the clouds. They pointed at the open sky. They argued that water was not a sentient employee of the Lord. But medieval logic was a one-way street. The Lord insisted that because the clouds drifted over his land, they were cooperating with him. This was, of course, nonsense. But nonsense is powerful when it is backed by armed men. So the game of cat and mouse continued. People tried collecting rainwater secretly. They hid barrels behind their houses. They placed buckets under eaves only in the dead of night. During storms, they would stand outside and cup their hands discreetly, trying to drink a few drops without looking like they were enjoying it. But the Lord's guards were relentless. They patrolled during rainfall with the same energy modern security uses to chase teenagers out of malls. They were the rain police. Some peasants were fined for hoarding moisture. One woman was accused of stealing atmospheric resources. A man was charged after being caught running outside with a bucket during a drizzle. His crime was described formally in the court records as attempted precipitation theft. In the end, even the weather wasn't free in medieval Europe. Rain itself became part of the feudal economy. It was a perfect symbol of an age where nature belonged to whoever shouted "mine" loudest while holding a sword. From the wet sky, we look down to the damp earth, to the grass. Grass was the one medieval resource that nobody thought to monetize. It grew everywhere. It required zero effort. It tasted like disappointment, which made it useless to humans, but perfect for cows, goats, and sheep. For generations, animals wandered freely across the commons. The commons were shared lands. They belonged to the village as a collective. Animals nibbled as nature intended, blissfully unaware of the economic nightmare about to be created on their behalf. Everything changed the day a nobleman rode past the fields. He noticed something terrifying: peasant livestock grazing for free. His mind, naturally unburdened by morality or agricultural knowledge, began to panic. Free grazing meant free animals. Free animals meant wealth for peasants. And wealth for peasants meant they might start asking questions like, "Why are we starving while you have 12 kitchens?" This could not be allowed. So he invented grazing rights. This was a term that sounded official, bureaucratic, and dignified, but it was really just a fancy way of saying, "I am charging you for the grass that literally grows out of the ground by itself." The announcement was delivered with theatrical gravitas. The baron declared that all grass, whether standing, partially chewed, or entirely theoretical, belonged exclusively to him. The legal definitions of trespassing were expanded to include livestock psychology. If a cow looked at grass on his land, that was trespassing. If a goat walked near grass, that was attempted theft. If a sheep even thought about grass, the Lord considered that conspiracy. Suddenly, the commons, land historically shared by the entire village, became a legal minefield. Cows could no longer wander. Goats could no longer roam. Shepherds, who used to be peaceful figures leaning on crooks and watching clouds, had to become overworked security guards. They had to constantly scan the horizon for the baron's tax collectors, who lurked behind shrubs like medieval paparazzi. Some peasants attempted diplomacy. "My lord," they explained, "this grass has always been free." But the baron, a man who believed the earth itself answered to his boots, simply replied, "It is free for me." His smile did not reach his eyes, possibly because his eyes had never expressed warmth before. Soon, poor families were spending half their income just to let their animals eat. The irony was staggering. The peasants fed the animals fed the Lord's taxes, and the Lord fed on the satisfaction of turning sunshine, soil, and chlorophyll into a revenue stream. A few rebellious peasants tried sneaking their animals onto common land at night. Imagine these moonlit missions. They looked like undercover heists. Men moving silently in the dark. But the treasure wasn't gold, it was grass. And the thieves were exhausted sheep. In the end, medieval grass became one of the most profitable inventions of the Middle Ages. Not because the grass changed, but because someone woke up, looked at a meadow, and shouted the most dangerous word in feudal Europe: mine. We have seen the water, the fire, the wood, the rain, and the grass enclosed. What was left? There was one thing medieval peasants depended on more than hope or prayer. It was beer. This was not because they loved the taste. Medieval beer often tasted like anxiety and wet hay. It was cloudy, it was weak, it was thick. They drank it because the water could kill you faster than an invading army. Beer was liquid safety. The brewing process boiled the water, killing the bacteria. Beer was hydration with training wheels. It was the only beverage a medieval villager could drink without contemplating their imminent funeral. Naturally, this meant the authorities had to ruin it. Home brewing was once a simple communal ritual. Every household crafted its own brew. They used barley, whatever herbs were nearby, and sometimes ingredients that should never have entered a liquid meant for human consumption. But it was theirs, and it was free. Then one day, a town councilman, whose personality likely resembled stale bread, realized something horrifying. People were enjoying beer without paying him. This discovery triggered an intense emotional crisis. It was the kind of panic nobles felt when peasants smiled for too long. To fix this tragedy, the council introduced the ale tax. It was a brilliant invention designed to ensure that the only safe drink in medieval Europe now required government approval. Suddenly, your humble brewing pot transformed from a family tradition into a suspicious object of state interest. Inspectors began prowling through villages. They sniffed the air like overworked bloodhounds, searching for the unmistakable smell of unlicensed joy. A woman stirring a pot in her kitchen could be confronted by a sweaty official demanding to know whether she was making soup or engaging in unsanctioned beverage production. There was no correct answer. To brew legally, peasants had to visit the ale conner. Let us pause to appreciate this job title, the ale conner. This was a man whose job was to taste beer professionally and whose liver had likely retired years ago. He would decide, with the solemnity of a judge sentencing a criminal, whether your beer was worthy of public consumption. If approved, you paid a fee. If not approved, you still paid a fee. Medieval justice was refreshingly predictable. Brewing without permission became a dangerous underground activity. Families brewed at night behind shuttered windows. They prayed that their bubbling barley mush wouldn't betray them with a loud hiss at the wrong moment. Children acted as lookouts. They stood on street corners watching for the dim glow of the tax collector's lantern. Entire neighborhoods developed a secret network of signals, whistles like birds, but more terrified, just to warn each other when inspectors were approaching. In the end, medieval beer was no longer the humble drink that connected thirsty peasants to survival. It became a symbol of everything wrong with the Middle Ages: corruption, regulation, and the unshakable belief among the elite that joy must always come with a receipt. This philosophy of licensed joy extended to the market itself. Medieval markets began as wholesome, chaotic gatherings. Peasants shouted prices, chickens escaped frequently. Nobody had any idea what sanitation meant. They were loud, messy, and filled with the aroma of unwashed bodies and vegetables that were technically edible. Best of all, they were free to enter. You could walk in, set up a cloth on the ground, and sell your onions with the confidence of a capitalist who owned absolutely nothing. Naturally, this could not continue. One day, a lord stood on his balcony. He looked down at the lively marketplace. He felt a sharp personal pain. It was the pain of watching people trade goods without paying him first. Free enterprise on his dirt? Bold, dangerous, unacceptable. So, he installed a market gate. He hired a man whose job was to be permanently irritated. And he announced that everyone entering the market now owed a stall fee. Overnight, every peasant selling turnips was transformed into a reluctant taxpayer. Medieval fees multiplied faster than bedbugs in a monastery. First came the entrance fee, because walking into the market apparently required financial commitment. Then came the space fee, because your 1 square meter of dirt was suddenly premium real estate. Then came the merchant fee, for the Lord's generous act of letting you breathe his air while selling your produce. The Lord had successfully monetized existence. The peasants adapted as best they could. Some squeezed 3 families' goods onto a single cloth to save money. This created a shopping experience so cramped it resembled a medieval thrift store designed by someone who hated joy. Others attempted to enter the market early to avoid the collectors, only to discover that the collectors slept at the gate like dedicated trolls. The worst part was that the Lord offered no services in exchange. The ground was uneven, the stalls were crooked, the smell was catastrophic. Bandits wandered the aisles like confused customers. Stray dogs stole sausages directly from tables. Chickens launched escape attempts with surprising intelligence. Yet, the fees kept rising. A few daring peasants attempted to form unofficial markets in nearby meadows where trading was free and spirits were high. Naturally, the Lord shut these down immediately. He declared them illegal gatherings, which was medieval code for, "You forgot to pay me." By the end of it all, medieval markets transformed from simple communal gatherings into early prototypes of shopping malls, crowded, overpriced, and controlled entirely by someone who never shopped there. We leave the enclosed world of the peasant now. We leave the land where every stick, stone, and drop of rain has a price. We travel south. We travel back in time to a place where the air smells of salt and iron, where the only law is the will of the emperor. We are going to meet the iron boar. Section 2. The Iron Boar. Leave the muddy fields of the medieval peasant now. Leave the rain-soaked thatch and the silent forests. We are traveling back further into the deep past. We are going to a place where the earth meets the sea, and where history was forged not in gold, but in iron and salt water. We are entering the world of the Roman legions. Specifically, we are following the ghost of one unit, Legio Decima Fretensis, the 10th Legion of the Strait. This was not a machine that emerged from the calm, orderly parade grounds of Rome. It was not born in the sunlight of the Forum, surrounded by marble statues and cheering crowds. Its birth was violent, messy, and soaked in the saltwater spray that gave the legion its famous name. Fretensis comes from the Latin fretum, meaning a strait. Specifically, the Strait of Messina, the dangerous, churning channel of water that separates Sicily from Italy. It was here, in the chaos of the civil wars that tore the Roman Republic apart, that the earliest soldiers of this unit first proved themselves. Imagine the scene. It is the 1st century BC. You are not marching on a road. You are standing on the heaving deck of a wooden warship. The wind is howling. The sea is rough. You are wearing heavy armor, chainmail, or segmented iron that threatens to drag you to the bottom if you slip. It was not common for Roman legions to fight at sea. The Roman genius was for the land, for marching, for digging, for holding the line on solid ground. The sea was unpredictable. The sea was chaos. But Julius Caesar, the man who crafted this legion, did not care about convention. He loved 2 things above all: glory and legions that made him look unstoppable. If Caesar needed infantrymen to sprint across the wet deck of a ship during a storm and hack apart Pompeian sailors, he expected the 10th to smile, salute, and do it. And they did. From its first days, Legio Dex was shaped not by the drill instructor's staff, but by storms, blades, and the chaotic geography of the Mediterranean. They absorbed this identity. It carved itself into their pride as deeply as it was carved into their shields. They were the soldiers of the strait. They were the men who could walk on water, provided that water was stained with blood. To represent this nature, they chose a symbol. Every legion had a soul, an animal spirit, that appeared on their standards and their skins. Some chose the eagle, noble and distant. Some chose the bull, strong and steady. The 10th chose the boar. I want you to visualize this animal, the wild boar. It is not a creature of grace. It is a creature of the earth. It is low to the ground. It is heavy. It has a thick, bristled hide that can turn aside thorns and spears. It is an animal that does not know how to retreat. When a boar is cornered, it does not panic. It charges. It charges head first into danger, with its tusks lowered, refusing to die cleanly. The men of the 10th liked this symbolism. It matched their nature. They were stubborn. They were fearless. They were ready to smash through anything keeping them from their objective. By the time the empire settled into its golden age, the reputation of Legio X Fretensis was already solid. They were known as one of Rome's most aggressive and reliable legions. They were loyal to a fault. They were brutal when ordered, and they were impossible to intimidate. But the salt spray of the strait was not their final destination. The empire had a way of moving its pieces across the board, and the boar was about to be sent to a place that was the opposite of the sea. They were marching toward the desert, toward the heat, toward the explosive province of Judea. Feel the temperature rise. The cool, damp winds of the Mediterranean are gone. We are now in the Judean hills. It is the middle of the 1st century AD. The 10th Legion has left the water behind. Now they are marching into an unpredictable furnace. Imagine the physical sensation of being a legionary here. You are carrying 60 pounds of gear. You are wearing lorica segmentata, plates of iron strapped across your chest and shoulders. In the European north, this armor was comforting. Here, under the relentless sun, it is an oven. The metal heats up. It burns the skin if the tunic underneath slips. The sweat runs down your back, soaking the wool, chafing the skin. The dust is everywhere. It is a fine, powdery grit that gets into your eyes, your mouth, and the hinges of your armor. The landscape itself felt hostile to the Romans. The breezy coasts and fertile plains they knew were replaced by harsh hills and scorching sun. And then there were the fortresses. Judea was a land of fortifications clinging to cliffs like stubborn barnacles. It was a vertical landscape, hard to climb, hard to hold. But it wasn't just the geography, it was the people. The 10th Legion was an occupying force. They felt the eyes of the locals on them. The province was already simmering when the 10th arrived. Local tensions, religious divisions, and Rome's talent for overtaxing everyone had created a pot ready to boil over. Many Roman soldiers disliked Judea instantly. It was hot, dry, and full of people who refused to be impressed by Roman armor. You could feel the silence in the villages as the legion marched through. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, resentful silence. It was the silence of a people holding their breath before a scream. Rumors traveled faster than the marching columns. Stories of uprisings, stories of ambushes in the wadis, stories of fanatical rebels who carried daggers under their cloaks. The soldiers knew they were walking into a storm. This wasn't the peaceful retirement post that older soldiers joked about. This was a powder keg. And Legio 10, as usual, brought the spark. They were under the command of generals who trusted force more than diplomacy. They marched south, their hobnailed boots grinding the ancient stones of the road. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The legion established its early positions in coastal strongholds like Caesarea, but they knew their true crucible would lie inland. The province was fractured. There were pockets of resistance everywhere. Every hill seemed to have a lookout. Every road had the potential for trouble. Patrols were attacked. Supply lines were harassed. Scouts vanished into the desert night, never to be seen again. In Roman terms, this meant only one thing. A full-scale rebellion was coming. And when it hit, Rome would not answer with negotiation. Rome would answer with overwhelming weight. The legion was assigned to the incoming imperial commander, Titus. He was the son of the emperor. He was ambitious, strategic, and perfectly willing to break a city if it wouldn't obey. The men of the legion sharpened their blades. They oiled their armor to keep the desert rust away. They prepared for a campaign that, even by Roman standards, promised brutality. They were marching toward the heart of the revolt, toward Jerusalem. This was the destination that would turn their name, once associated with the sea and Caesar's naval daring, into a symbol of destruction carved into the memory of an entire region. When Legio 10 Fortenses finally stood before Jerusalem, they stopped. They looked across the valley. They saw not just a city, but a fortress layered in stone, faith, and defiance. The rebels had turned every wall, tower, and gate into a declaration of resistance. For the legionaries who had fought in deserts, forests, and coastal straits, Jerusalem presented a new kind of challenge. It was a military puzzle. The city meant everything to its defenders. That kind of devotion often made sieges far uglier than Rome preferred. Titus knew this. He understood that the rebellion wouldn't be crushed by speed or dramatic charges. It would be crushed by patience, by precision, by the slow, grinding application of engineering. And so, Legio X, along with the other legions marching under his banner, set about doing what Rome did best, turning a city into a cage. The 10th was positioned on the Mount of Olives. This was a strategic choice. It was east of the city. It was close enough to see the walls, the temples, the markets, even the rooftops where watchers stood like statues. From here, the legion's engineers wasted no time. The first sound of the siege was not the clash of swords. It was the sound of digging. Thud, thud, thud. Thousands of men began to reshape the earth. They constructed siege camps. They built watchtowers. They erected palisades. The thud of hammers, the groan of wood, and the grinding of stone echoed across the hills. It was a performance of industry. The rebels could see it happening. They could see the Roman machine assembling itself piece by piece. The psychological pressure built with every structure completed. But the defenders were not idle. They launched sorties, sudden, vicious attacks meant to disrupt the Roman works. The 10th found itself in constant skirmishes. One moment they were building ramps, shoveling dirt. The next moment they were grabbing shields to repel screaming fighters charging down the slope. The rebels fought with a ferocity that impressed even the hardened veterans of the legion. These were not disorganized raiders. They were desperate, skilled, and intimately familiar with their terrain. Still, Legio X pressed on. They brought up the machines, the artillery, ballistae, scorpions, machines capable of launching bolts and stones with enough force to impale a man through a shield. The legion began hurling projectiles into the city. They did this not just to damage structures, but to wear down morale. Every stone that crashed into a roof was a reminder. Rome is here, and Rome is not leaving. The siege was only in its opening phase, but the pattern was already clear. It was an unstoppable machine tightening its grip. The city might have walls, the city might have faith, but Legio X had time. They had iron, and they had an emperor's patience. And in a Roman siege, patience was often the deadliest weapon of all. The sun set over the Mount of Olives. The fires of the Roman camp flickered in the dark, thousands of them mirroring the stars above. The boar was awake, and it was hungry. As the siege of Jerusalem stretched on, the days blurred into a single grinding rhythm. Sieges are not glamorous events. In the movies, they are fast, filled with shouting and dramatic charges. In reality, a Roman siege was a contest of endurance. It was a slow, heavy, industrial process. For the men of Legio X Fretensis, the excitement of the arrival had faded. Now there was only the work. They understood that every hour spent digging, every hour spent dragging timber, was another thread tightening around the city's throat. The Roman method was mechanical. It was cold. It was the application of unstoppable force against an immovable object. The legionaries built towering siege platforms known as agoras. These were artificial hills made of earth and wood, rising slowly day by day until they looked the defenders in the eye. And then they brought the rams. I want you to visualize the battering ram. It was not just a log carried by men. It was a suspended engine of destruction. A massive trunk of oak, capped with iron, hanging from a frame on heavy chains. To protect it from the fire arrows and boiling oil raining down from the walls, the Romans covered the ram's housing with wet hides. Imagine the smell of that machine, the damp, musky scent of wet leather, the metallic tang of the iron head, the sweat of the men pulling the ropes. Heave, swing, thud. The defenders on the walls fought back with desperation. They hurled burning torches. They threw pots of pitch. They poured molten substances down on the Roman engineers. But the wet hides sizzled and steamed, protecting the wood beneath. The legionaries kept pushing. Every swing of the ram felt like pushing against the heartbeat of the city itself. Behind the rams, the artillery worked tirelessly. The ballistae, the scorpions. These were complex machines of torsion. Twisted ropes of hair or sinew stored immense energy. When the trigger was pulled, the arm snapped forward with a sound like a giant whip cracking. Snap. Crash. Stones the size of pumpkins slammed into the masonry. Each impact chipped away not just stone, but confidence. The defenders tried to cushion the blows. They lowered sacks of chaff or wool over the walls to absorb the shock. But the Romans simply cut the sacks down or set them on fire. The rebels stood on the battlements, shouting curses, firing arrows, and using slings to hurl stones back at the Romans. Yet Legio X simply adjusted formation. They raised their large rectangular shields. They locked them together. They became a tortoise of iron and wood. They marched forward again. This relentlessness, this cold, disciplined, mechanical refusal to stop was what terrified Rome's enemies far more than their swords. You can fight a man. It is very hard to fight a machine. Eventually, the physics of the situation took over. The constant bombardment paid off. Cracks began to spiderweb through the ancient limestone. The mortar, dried by centuries of sun, began to crumble. Stones loosened. Sections of the walls sagged under their own weight. The defenders inside scrambled. You can imagine the panic. They stacked debris, timber, and furniture behind the weak points in a frantic attempt to keep the Roman steel out. But the legionaries could smell the collapse. They felt it in the ground beneath their boots. The tremors of the ram were changing. The sound was changing from a solid thud to a hollow crack. They saw the foundations bulging. Every legionary knew what came next. The engineering phase was ending. The slaughter phase was beginning. When the walls finally buckled, it wasn't a clean break. It was a slow, agonizing crumble. A section of the wall simply gave up, sliding down into a heap of rubble and dust. A roar went up, not just from Legio X, but from every Roman soldier in the valley. It was the signal. The cage was broken. Now, the battle would shift. It would no longer be about ballistae and ramps. It would be about street fighting, house to house, temple to courtyard. Jerusalem was about to become a maze, and Legio X Fretensis was the torch that would be carried through it. Stepping through the breach in the wall was like stepping into a different world. Outside, the valley was open, vast, and dominated by the grand scale of the siege works. Inside, Jerusalem was a labyrinth. The 10th Legion advanced cautiously at first. They had been in cities before, Alexandria, Cyrene, but Jerusalem was different. Its layout was a tangle of courtyards, narrow twisting streets, sudden staircases, and rooftop paths. It was a city built on hills, meaning the ground was never level. The rebels used this terrain like a second weapon. Every turn in the alley could hide a slinger. Every doorway could hide a spearman. Every rooftop was a platform for raining down stones and roof tiles. The legionaries, trained to fight in wide, open formations where they could support each other, had to adapt quickly. Their formations broke down into small, flexible squads. Their shields became roofs to protect them from above. Their movements became slow and deliberate. Check the corner, clear the room, move up. And then the smoke joined the chaos. Fires broke out. Some were caused by Roman artillery hitting wooden structures. Some were set by the rebels to create barriers. The city began to choke on its own burning insides. Imagine the sensory overload. The heat of the fire mixing with the heat of the desert. The stinging smoke making your eyes water, blurring the enemy into shadows. The sound of beams cracking and roofs collapsing. For Legio 10, the smoke made visibility worse, but it also created panic among the defenders. Fire had no loyalty. It consumed rebels and Romans alike, destroying hiding places and forcing fighters into the open. Despite the danger, the Legion pushed forward. Their discipline held them together like iron hinges in a storm. Officers shouted orders above the roar of the flames. Horns signaled movements between alleys. Even amid the soot and the ash, the boar emblem of the Legion moved steadily forward. The painted shields were now blackened. The polished armor was dull with grime. Jerusalem fought back with the desperation of a cornered animal. Rebels launched ambushes from tunnels. Archers shot from the high walls of the temple complex. Groups of defenders hurled stones from rooftops until Roman troops stormed the stairs and cleared them. The city's sacred geography, its marketplaces, its holy courtyards, became scenes of bitter, close-quarters combat. But Legio 10 had something the rebels lacked, an unswerving certainty of victory. Rome did not retreat inside cities. Rome consumed them. With every street taken, every barricade crushed, the Legion advanced deeper toward the heart of the city. All roads, burning and ruined, led toward one place, the temple. The temple was not merely a church. It was a fortress. It was the spiritual heart of the rebellion, the last anchor that held their morale together. The defenders believed that as long as the temple stood, God might still intervene. If the temple fell, the revolt would collapse with it. This made the final confrontation inevitable. It was a clash not just for a building, but for the soul of a people. Titus, the Roman commander, understood the symbolic power of this place. History tells us he initially wanted the temple preserved. A destroyed holy site is a monument to resentment that lasts forever. A captured holy site is proof of Roman superiority. But wars have a way of ignoring the wishes of commanders. When fire, fear, and exhausted soldiers mixed together inside a city already half in ashes, accidents happen. Legio 10 advanced along the eastern approaches, pushing through barricades made of overturned carts and smashed furniture. The fighting here was brutal and suffocating. No grand formations, just the grinding push of shields and blades in sacred halls. The defenders fought with renewed fury. Every rebel who rushed forward knew he was buying a few more minutes for the sanctuary behind him. Roman soldiers hacked through heavy wooden doors. They splintered gates. They cleared rooms one by one. And then, somewhere in the chaos, a spark caught where it shouldn't have. Perhaps a soldier threw a torch in anger. Perhaps a piece of burning debris drifted on the wind. The ancient cedar wood of the temple complex was dry from the fierce summer heat. It ignited instantly. The fire jumped from beam to beam, accelerated by the wind sweeping over the mount. Within moments, flames crawled up the massive stone pillars. They ran across the gilded ceilings. The defenders screamed for water. The Romans begged for order. But the blaze no longer listened to anyone. Legio 10 tried to contain it, but war has no interest in preservation. The fire roared higher. The gold began to melt. The stone began to crack under the intense heat. As the roof was consumed, rebels attacked with wild desperation, attempting both to repel the Romans and save the temple simultaneously. The legionaries fought them off step by step until collapsing floors and choking smoke made the outcome inevitable. The temple burned. A sacred symbol turned to ash. Its collapse echoed across the hills like a final, shattering truth. Jerusalem's fate was sealed. Legio 10 Fretensis had witnessed the death of a civilization's heart. They stood on the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount, their faces illuminated by the inferno. They were covered in dust. They were covered in soot. They were exhausted. But the war was not quite over. The city was broken, but the silence had not yet fallen. There were still shadows to clear. There were still echoes to silence. And the legion would remain to ensure that the silence, when it came, would last for centuries. When the temple fell, the heart of the revolt stopped beating. But the body of the city was not yet dead. With the sanctuary reduced to a smoldering skeleton and Jerusalem gasping under layers of ash, Legio 10 Fretensis found itself in the final, most stubborn phase of the campaign. This was the phase that history books often gloss over, but which soldiers know is the most exhausting. It was the manhunt. The destruction of the city's spiritual center had shattered the revolt's unity, but not the determination of its survivors. Many defenders retreated. They vanished into the fortified quarters of the upper city. They slipped into underground passages. They hid in secret chambers beneath the cobblestones. For the legion, the nature of the fighting changed again. Gone were the amassed charges. Gone were the grand artillery bombardments. Instead, the war became personal. It became a slow, dangerous search through a warren of debris. Imagine the psychological weight of this task. You are a soldier of the 10th. You are tired. You have been digging and fighting for months. The air is still thick with the smell of burning cedar and stone dust. You move through ruins that feel haunted. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every pile of rubble could be a trap. The surviving rebels fought with the ferocity of men who had nothing left to lose. Some hurled themselves at Roman shields with makeshift weapons. Others launched sudden attacks from collapsed roofs. It was an urban jungle of smoke and stone. But if there was one thing Legion X excelled at, it was systematic destruction. They did not rush. They moved through the ruins like a cold tide, clearing the city block by block. Engineers collapsed tunnels. They sealed hidden rooms. They broke through walls to expose fighters hiding inside. Slowly, the last pockets broke. The upper city, the district of wealthy homes and massive stones, was the final bastion. The Legion advanced up the staircases, slick with dust. They battered down gates, reinforced with furniture. When the last resistance faded, the silence that fell over Jerusalem was total. The city that had once defied the empire was now a carcass. Fallen walls, burnt sanctuaries, silent streets. Legio X Fretensis stood as the primary executioner of Rome's will. Their shields were scorched. The boar emblem on their standards was blackened by smoke. But they were the only thing left standing. The siege was over. But for the 10th Legion, the story was not ending. It was evolving. Usually when a war ends, the army leaves. They pack up their tents, they dismantle their siege engines, and they march home to parades and wine. But Legio X did not leave Judea. Rome needed a permanent reminder for the region. They needed something more persuasive than taxes and governors. They needed a physical embodiment of fear, discipline, and consequence. And so, the emperor chose the perfect instrument. The same legion that had broken the rebellion would remain as its jailer. The 10th Legion established its new headquarters directly on the ruins of Jerusalem. Consider the symbolism of this. They did not build next to the city. They built on it. They parked themselves on the western hill. They built barracks. They built workshops. They built granaries. They built walls over the remains of the lives they had just extinguished. Rome camps were not temporary campsites. They were organisms that grew, hardened, and transformed landscapes. Soon, the boar insignia flew over ground that had once been sacred. Their presence changed the rhythm of Judea entirely. Patrols marched the roads daily. Watchtowers sprang up along major routes. Checkpoints monitored movement between towns. The legion became the backbone of Roman control. They were a constant reminder that resistance was not merely futile, it was suicidal. They handled the job with cold efficiency. They put down minor uprisings. They escorted officials. They guarded supply caravans. They built infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, fortified posts, all carrying the unmistakable stamp of Roman engineering. Even people who never saw a Roman soldier could feel their influence in the stone beneath their feet. Years turned into decades. The veterans who had fought the siege grew old and died. New recruits arrived, but the legion remained. They were there when the Bar Kokhba revolt exploded decades later, a rebellion even fiercer than the first. The 10th was once again at the center of the storm, dismantling rebel strongholds and collapsing cave systems. After that second war, the erasure was complete. The Roman authorities rebuilt the region into a new identity. The province was renamed Syria Palestina. Jerusalem was renamed Aelia Capitolina. It was no longer a Jewish capital. It was a Roman colony with temples to Jupiter. The old memories were smothered under Roman urban planning. Legio Tenfortensis eventually left centuries later, but they left their mark in the soil. Archaeologists today still find it. Coins bearing the boar emblem found in the dirt, forts clinging to ridges, roof tiles and bricks stamped with the letters LXF. The legion was more than a military unit. It was an era. It was a force that reshaped landscapes and destinies. Its legacy was written not on parchment, but in the ashes of cities and the scars of the earth. Section 3. The Brotherhood of Craft. Let the dust of the desert settle. Let the iron order of Rome fade into memory. We travel forward in time and north in geography. We find ourselves in the damp, gray, energetic world of medieval Europe. By the 12th century, the quiet towns of the early Middle Ages had vanished. In their place, cities had exploded into life. They were noisy, they were competitive, they were chaotic centers of trade. Imagine walking through one of these towns. Carts jammed the narrow streets, their wheels locked in mud. Workshops spilled noise and smoke directly into the alleys. Foreign merchants unloaded goods at dawn, speaking languages you didn't know. Bakers shouted prices. Tanners stank up entire districts with the smell of urine and leather. It was vibrant, but it was also dangerous. In the middle of all this energy, craftsmen faced a growing problem. The problem was freedom. Not the romantic kind of freedom we cherish today, but the dangerous, unregulated kind. In this chaotic market, anyone could claim to be a carpenter. Anyone could claim to be a butcher, a shoemaker, or, heaven forbid, a surgeon, with nothing but a rusty knife and a lot of confidence. Markets were swelling, but so were the risks. Fraudsters sold ale that was watered down until it was barely brown water. Butchers stretched meat supplies with tricks that are better left undescribed. Weavers copied intricate patterns without the skill to make them last. Newcomers, drawn from the countryside and the slums, jumped into trades without training, undercutting prices and threatening the reputations of honest workers. For a medieval craftsman, your name was everything. If customers no longer trusted the quality of a Paris shoe or London bread because of a few bad actors, your livelihood collapsed. There was no government agency to protect them, no Better Business Bureau, no police force. Something had to bring order to this mess. The solution didn't come from kings or bishops. It came from the craftsmen themselves. They began forming sworn associations, groups of workers united not by blood or by lordship, but by their trade. These were the first guilds, alliances built for survival in a world where markets grew faster than rules. At first, they were small circles, a few men agreeing on basic standards. A baker agreed not to sell bread that crumbled to dust. A blacksmith agreed not to forge horseshoes that snapped after 2 steps. A shoemaker agreed not to stitch leather so thin it tore in the rain. It was a pact of quality. But as towns expanded, so did the guild's ambitions. They realized that if they controlled quality, they might as well control everything else. Prices, training, competition, even who was allowed to practice a craft at all. What began as a pact of cooperation slowly hardened into a system of absolute power. Joining a guild was no longer casual. It was a privilege. Members swore oaths, paid dues, attended meetings, and defended their shared interests like a brotherhood. In a world where kings ruled kingdoms and lords ruled lands, guilds ruled the streets. And to understand how this system worked, how it enclosed the chaos of the market into a rigid box of order, we must start at the very bottom, with the boy who swept the floor. To understand the rise of the guild, you have to start at its beating heart, the training ladder. Medieval crafts weren't learned through books. They weren't learned in classrooms. They were absorbed. They were learned through sleepless nights, calloused hands, and years spent under the watchful eye of a master. The guilds ensured that every craftsman, whether a baker, a blacksmith, a cooper, or a goldsmith, followed the exact same path. It began with the apprentice. He was often a boy as young as 10 or 12. His parents would negotiate a contract with a master. It was a serious document. It promised the boy's total obedience in exchange for training, food, and a place to sleep. A place to sleep usually meant a pile of straw on the floor of the workshop itself. Apprenticeship wasn't romantic. It was exhausting. Imagine the daily life of this boy. He swept the floors. He chopped the wood. He stirred the vats. He fetched the water. He stretched the hides. He endured endless scolding. He was the invisible labor that kept the shop running. For years, he might not even be allowed to touch the expensive tools. He watched. He listened. He learned the first fragile steps of the craft. This was the crucible. The guild didn't just want workers. They wanted loyalty. They wanted discipline. They wanted tradition. The apprentice absorbed all three before he was ever trusted to work unsupervised. This phase lasted a long time, sometimes 5 years, sometimes 7. 7 years of childhood spent inside the walls of a single shop, breathing the dust of the trade. But if he survived it, if he endured the scolding and the sweeping, he earned the right to step up. He earned the right to walk out the door. He became a journeyman. When the 7 years of dust and sweeping were over, the apprentice was released. He was no longer a boy. He was a young man, his hands hardened by the tools of his trade. He had earned a new title, one that carried with it the first taste of freedom. He was a journeyman. The word comes from the French journée, meaning day. It was a literal description of his life. He was now a day worker. He was no longer bound to one master by a contract of servitude. He was paid for his labor, coin by coin, day by day. But more importantly, he was free to travel. In fact, the guilds encouraged it. This period was often called the Wanderjahr, the wandering years. It was a time to leave the narrow streets of his hometown and see the world. Imagine the sensation of stepping onto the road. For 7 years, your world has been the size of a workshop. Now, the horizon is open. Journeymen traveled from town to town, carrying their tools wrapped in oilcloth. They were the bees of the medieval economy, cross-pollinating the continent with skills. A stonemason from Paris might walk all the way to Cologne to learn how they carved the gargoyles on the new cathedral. A weaver from Flanders might travel south to Florence to see how they dyed the wool so red. Trade routes became rivers of shared knowledge, and the journeymen were the water flowing through them. But this freedom was fragile. A journeyman was always an outsider. When he arrived in a new town, he had to find a master willing to hire him for a day or a week. He slept in unfamiliar lofts. He ate unfamiliar food. He was always moving, always learning, but never settling. He was a man in waiting, because the road had a destination. The journeyman did not want to wander forever. He wanted to stop. He wanted to own his own workshop. He wanted to marry. He wanted to sit at the high table. He wanted to become a master. But the guilds guarded that door with a heavy iron lock. To open it, you had to do more than just work hard. You had to prove that you were worthy of the brotherhood. You had to create a masterpiece. The masterpiece was not a metaphor. It was a physical test. To ascend from the rank of journeyman to master, a craftsman had to produce a single, flawless item that proved he had conquered every secret of the trade. The requirements were specific and unforgiving. If you were a carpenter, you might have to build a chest with perfect joinery. No nails, just wood fitting into wood so tightly that water couldn't get in. If you were a silversmith, it might be a chalice without a single hammer mark or dent. If you were a shoemaker, it might be a boot stitched so finely that the leather seemed to have grown that way. If you were a baker, it might be a loaf of bread with the exact weight and texture specified by the guild statutes. Imagine the pressure. You have spent years on the road. You have saved your coins. You have rented a small corner of a workshop to work on this final project. Everything depends on this object. Your future income, your social status, your identity. When it was finished, you didn't just sell it, you presented it. You stood before the ruling council of the guild, the existing masters. These were the men who owned the workshops, trained the apprentices, and set the prices. They were the elite. They would examine your work with the critical eyes of men who wanted to keep their circle small. They looked for a flaw, a loose thread, a rough edge, a bubble in the glass. If they found one, you failed. You remained a journeyman. You went back to the road. But if the work was flawless, if the chest closed with a perfect click, if the shoe fit perfectly, then the masters would nod. They would accept your fees, which were always high. They would swear you in. You were no longer a day worker. You were a master. You had crossed the threshold from the chaotic outside world into the fortress of the guild. The guild hall was the physical embodiment of the brotherhood. It was often the grandest building in the city, second only to the church. Inside, the air smelled of roasted meat, beeswax candles, and expensive wine. To be a master was to belong to a family. The guilds were not just business associations. They were social anchors in a turbulent world. Every guild had its own patron saint, a spiritual protector for the trade. The bakers honored Saint Honoratus. The masons worshipped under the protection of the Virgin Mary. The goldsmiths revered Saint Eligius. When the masters gathered for a feast, they didn't see rivals. They saw brothers. They sat according to strict hierarchy. Masters at the high table, journeymen lower down, apprentices barely allowed in the room. They sang songs that only they knew. They shared secrets, recipes for dyes, formulas for alloys, methods for tempering steel that were forbidden to outsiders. And they took care of their own. If a master died, the guild paid for his burial. If his workshop burned down, the guild rebuilt it. If his children were orphaned, the guild became their guardian. In a medieval world that lacked any form of social security or insurance, the guild was a safety net woven from brotherhood and dues. But this warmth came with a price. The guild was a fortress, and fortresses are defined by their walls. The primary function of the guild was not just to support its members, but to control everyone else. They ruled through oaths. When you joined, you swore a solemn, binding oath. You promised to uphold quality. You promised to protect secrets. You promised to obey the rules. And the rules were astonishingly detailed. A guild of bakers might dictate the exact weight of a loaf of bread down to the ounce. A guild of butchers might specify which parts of an animal could be sold fresh and which had to be salted. A guild of goldsmiths insisted on purity tests for every ring and necklace. This wasn't just about pride. It was economic warfare. By establishing universal standards, the guilds made sure that no member could undercut the others. If everyone sold bread of the same weight for the same price, there was no competition. There was only stability. And if someone tried to break the rules, if a greedy baker tried to mix sawdust into his flour to save money, or if a shoemaker used cheap leather, the guild had teeth. They appointed men known as wardens or searchers. Imagine these men. They were the medieval equivalent of a police force for objects. They had the authority to walk into any workshop unannounced at any time of day or night. They would march in. They would inspect the goods. They would weigh the bread. They would test the cloth. If they found fraud, they didn't just leave a bad review. They took action. They fined the craftsman. They confiscated the substandard goods. In extreme cases, they would drag the bad items out into the public square and smash them in front of the entire town. Public shame was a powerful tool. If the guild said your work was bad, you were finished. No customer would trust you. No workshop would hire you. This system created a world of immense stability. When you bought a shoe in a guild town, you knew it was a good shoe. But it also created a world of exclusion. The guilds were clubs, and like all clubs, they kept people out. Women were largely excluded from the hierarchy, despite doing much of the work in textiles and brewing. Migrants from the countryside were blocked by impossible entry fees. Jews were often barred entirely. And innovation, the spark of new ideas, was often smothered. If a clever weaver invented a new loom that worked twice as fast, the guild didn't celebrate him. They feared him. A faster loom threatened the stability of the group. It threatened to put others out of work, so they banned the loom. They chose order over progress. They chose the collective over the individual. For centuries, this system worked. The guild halls stood tall. The feasts continued. The masters grew fat and wealthy. But outside the heavy oak doors of the guild hall, the wind was changing. The Black Death was coming. The merchants were rising, and the tight control the guilds held over the world was about to slip through their fingers like sand. The 14th century arrived not with a whimper, but with a hammer blow that would shatter the carefully constructed order of the guilds. It came from the East, carried on the backs of rats and in the blood of fleas, aboard merchant ships docking in Messina and Genoa. It was the great mortality, the Black Death. We often think of the plague as a medical event, a time of sickness and tragedy. But for the Brotherhood of Craft, it was an economic earthquake that shook the foundations of their fortress. Imagine the sensory world of the city in 1348. The noise, the defining characteristic of medieval urban life, simply stopped. The rhythmic banging of the blacksmith's hammer, silenced. The shouting of the baker selling hot loaves, silenced. The clatter of the weaver's loom, silenced. The plague did not discriminate between the apprentice sweeping the floor and the master sitting at the high table. It swept through the workshops with terrifying efficiency. In some towns, half the population vanished in a single season. Entire households of craftsmen, master, wife, children, journeymen, apprentices, were wiped out in a week. Tools lay on benches, gathering dust, waiting for hands that would never pick them up again. Kilns went cold. Leather dried out and cracked in the vats. For the survivors, the world had changed overnight. The rigid ladder of the guild, apprentice to journeyman to master, was suddenly broken. Paradoxically, this catastrophe created a brief, strange, golden age for the common worker. For centuries, labor had been cheap. There were always more boys wanting to be apprentices than there were spots in the workshops. The masters held all the power. They could dictate low wages and long hours because, if you didn't like it, there were 10 people waiting to take your place. But after the plague, the streets were empty. Labor was scarce. Suddenly, the surviving journeyman realized his own value. He looked around the empty workshop. He realized that without him, the master could not produce a single shoe or horseshoe or loaf of bread. He stopped asking. He started demanding. Journeymen demanded higher wages. They demanded better food. They demanded shorter hours. And the masters, desperate to keep their businesses alive, had to agree. The balance of power, which had been frozen in stone for centuries, began to tip. The guilds tried to fight back. They panicked. They appealed to kings and city councils to pass laws freezing wages at pre-plague levels. They tried to force men to work. But you cannot legislate against supply and demand. The market had changed. The deferential, obedient brotherhood was fracturing. Journeymen formed their own associations, yeoman guilds, to protect themselves against the masters. The idea of a unified family of craft was replaced by the modern reality of employer versus employee. The silence of the plague had broken the spell of the guild. The fortress walls were cracking. As the city slowly recovered, a new figure emerged from the chaos. He was not a maker of things. He was a mover of things. The merchant. For a long time, the craftsman and the merchant had needed each other. The weaver made the cloth. The merchant sold it. But as trade routes expanded beyond the horizon, their interests began to collide. The conflict boiled down to one simple question: who controlled the city? The guilds wanted stability. They wanted to keep prices high, quality perfect, and production limited. They wanted a local market where they knew every customer by name. The merchants wanted the opposite. They wanted volume. They wanted to buy cheap and sell dear. They wanted to trade with Bruges, with Venice, with Novgorod, with Cairo. They didn't care about the brotherhood of the weavers. They cared about filling the hold of a ship with 1,000 bolts of cloth before the tide turned. To the merchants, the guild's strict rules were not protection. They were chains. Why can't we hire more workers? Why can't we use this cheaper dye? Why do we have to wait for a masterpiece inspection? The merchants began to bypass the guilds entirely. This was the birth of the putting out system. Rich merchants realized they didn't need the expensive, regulated labor of the city guilds. They rode out into the countryside. They found peasant families who had spare time in the winter. They gave the peasants raw wool. The peasants spun it and wove it in their own homes, far away from the prying eyes of the guild wardens. The merchant came back a month later, paid them a low wage, and took the finished cloth. It was cheaper, it was faster, and it was completely outside the guild's control. The guilds were furious. They tried to ban the import of foreign goods. They tried to fine the merchants. They held protests in the streets, marching with their banners and their tools. But they were fighting the tide. Money was becoming more powerful than tradition. Capitalism was waking up. The guild halls, once the centers of political power, began to lose their grip. Kings and governments started to side with the merchants because merchants paid better taxes. The era of the moral economy, where prices were set by what was fair, was ending. The era of the market economy, where prices were set by what people would pay, was beginning. The decline of the guilds was not a sudden collapse. It was a slow, melancholy fade. They did not disappear. They simply became irrelevant. They continued to meet. They continued to hold feasts. They continued to elect masters. But the real economic power had moved elsewhere. Innovation left them behind. When new technologies appeared, like stocking frames or mechanical looms, the guilds banned them to protect their jobs. But the merchants outside the city walls adopted them. The guilds became museums of an older way of life. They became social clubs for the respectable middle class rather than the engines of the economy. Masterpiece, once the ultimate test of skill, became a formality or an expensive fee that only the sons of existing masters could afford. The ladder was pulled up. By the time the Industrial Revolution arrived, the guilds were ghostly shells. But they left a legacy. The idea of the apprenticeship survived. The idea of collective bargaining, of workers standing together, survived in the form of trade unions. The pride in a job well done survived in the hands of artisans who still refused to compromise. But the medieval dream, the dream of a closed, protected, stable world where everyone knew their place and the market was tamed, was over. The enclosure of the economy was complete. The chaotic, open market had won. We leave Europe now. We leave the stone streets of London and the ruined walls of Jerusalem. We travel east, to the lands where the sun rises. We are going to meet a woman who started with nothing, not even her own name, and ended up holding the reins of the greatest empire on earth. We are going to the Golden Horn, to the Sultanate of Women. Section 4. The Sultanate of Women. We leave the cramped stone streets of the European cities now. We leave the fading guild halls and the silent looms. We travel east, far east, to the edge of the known world. We find ourselves on the wild borderlands between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the vast emptiness of the Tatar steppes. This was Ruthenia, a land of cold winters, dark soil, and shifting horizons.
Here, around the year 1502, a girl was born.
She entered history not as a princess. She had no titles. She likely had a Christian name, perhaps Alexandra or Anastasia, but history would strip that away from her. To the world, she would become known simply by her geography, Roxolana, the girl from Ruthenia. Her early life was defined by the open sky and the smell of the earth. But in this borderland, the open horizon was not a promise of freedom. It was a threat. It meant there were no walls to stop the raids.
When she was a young teenager, the world ended.
It didn't end with a plague or decree from a lord. It ended with the sound of hoofbeats. Tatar horsemen, slavers from the Crimean Khanate, swept through the village. Imagine the confusion, the smoke, the sudden, violent separation from everything you have ever known. She was taken captive. She was tied into a line of other prisoners, boys and girls, men and women, and forced to walk south. This was the slave road. It was a pipeline of human lives that stretched from the chilly plains of Ukraine down to the warm waters of the Black Sea. The journey was a slow erasure of identity. With every mile she walked, a piece of her past fell away. Her language, her religion, her family name. By the time she reached the slave markets of Kaffa in Crimea, she was no longer a person in the eyes of the law. She was inventory. She was loaded onto a ship. The smell of the steppe was replaced by the smell of salt water, tar, and unwashed bodies crammed into the hold. The ship sailed south, across the Black Sea, toward a city that gleamed like a jewel on the horizon. A city of domes and minarets sitting where the continents collided. Constantinople, Istanbul, the city of the world's desire. Most who traveled this road disappeared into the anonymity of servitude. They became domestic servants, laborers, or ghosts in the vast machinery of the Ottoman Empire. But this girl was different. She was not destined for a laundry room or a kitchen. She was purchased for the imperial palace itself. She was led through the massive gates of the Topkapi Palace, leaving the noise of the city behind and stepping into a world of silence, silk, and absolute power. The Topkapi Palace was not just a home for the Sultan. It was a city within a city. It was a fortress of secrets. When Roxolana walked through those gates, she entered a space designed to intimidate. The noise of Istanbul, the shouting merchants, the call to prayer, the clattering carts was cut off instantly. Inside, the rule was silence. Thousands of people lived and worked here, but they spoke in whispers. The Sultan, it was said, should not be disturbed by the noise of human existence. Even the pages and the guards used a form of sign language to communicate. Roxolana was led deep into the complex, past the courtyards where the janissaries stood like statues, past the kitchens that fed 10,000 people a day, and into the most secluded, guarded, and misunderstood section of the entire empire, the imperial harem. To the Western imagination, the harem was a place of hedonism, a fantasy of lounging women and luxury. To the women who lived there, it was something very different. It was a barracks. It was a monastery. It was a school. It was a political machine disguised as a residence. Roxolana entered at the very bottom of the hierarchy. She was an asimi, a novice. She slept in a dormitory with dozens of other girls. She had no privacy. She had no status. The harem was governed by a strict military-like discipline. The girls were woken at dawn for prayer. They spent their days in rigorous training. They learned Turkish, the language of the court. They learned Islam, the religion of the empire. They learned the intricate, exhausting rules of etiquette, how to walk without making a sound, how to pour coffee without spilling a drop, how to lower your eyes when a superior entered the room. They learned to embroider, to play music, to recite poetry. This was not a place of leisure. It was a place of high-stakes competition. Every girl knew the odds. Most would never even see the Sultan. They would serve the higher-ranking women for years, and eventually, if they were lucky, be married off to a minor official and leave the palace. But for the few who possessed beauty, intelligence, and luck, there was a ladder. From novice to concubine, Korea. From concubine to favorite, Iqbal. And the ultimate prize, mother of a prince, Valid. It was a climb up a glass mountain. One slip meant exile. One mistake meant invisibility. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The air smelled of rose water, musk, and fear. The walls were covered in beautiful blue Iznik tiles, cool to the touch, but they were still walls. It was a gilded cage. And in this cage, the girl from Ruthenia began to change. Roxolana did not fit the mold of the perfect Ottoman concubine. The ideal was quiet, submissive, and invisible until summoned. Roxolana was none of these things. She was small. She was not the most beautiful woman in the palace, but she had something else, something dangerous. She had a personality. She smiled. She joked. She laughed in a place where laughter was rationed. The other women noticed. The powerful eunuchs, the guardians of the harem, noticed. She earned a new name, given to her by the palace administration. Hüvem. It means de chehromvan, ya de joyful one. It was a fitting name, but perhaps deceptive. Beneath the cheerfulness lay a mind that was absorbing everything. While the other girls focused on embroidery, Harem focused on the power dynamics. She watched the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who ruled the harem with an iron fist. She watched the other favorites. She mapped the invisible lines of influence that ran through the corridors. She learned quickly that in the Ottoman court, charm was a weapon, intelligence was armor. And she prepared herself for the moment that would define her life. The moment she would cross the path of the most powerful man on earth. Sultan Suleiman. He was young, intelligent, and serious. He had just ascended to the throne. He was already being called the Magnificent by Europe and the Lawgiver by his own people. He was a man burdened by the weight of an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Nile. He was surrounded by people who feared him, people who wanted things from him, and people who worshipped him. But he was lonely. One night, the purple thread of destiny was pulled. Harem was selected for the Sultan. In the ritual of the harem, this was a moment of terror. A girl would be bathed, perfumed, and dressed in fine silks. She would be led to the Sultan's private quarters. She would enter, kiss the hem of his robe, and wait for his command. Usually, this encounter was brief. A sultan might see a concubine once or twice. If she did not become pregnant, she would likely never see him again. She would fade back into the dormitory. But Hurrem did not fade. When she met Suleiman, she did not just offer submission. She offered conversation. She spoke to him. She made him laugh. She recited poetry. Perhaps poetry she had written herself. She looked him in the eye, violating centuries of protocol with a spark of humanity that startled him. She treated him not as a god, but as a man. Suleiman was disarmed. He was intrigued. He found in this strange, laughing girl from the north a companion who could match his intellect. He summoned her again the next night, and the next. The harem whispered. The eunuchs exchanged glances. The established favorites felt a cold chill run down their spines. One mother, one son rule was the bedrock of Ottoman succession politics. A concubine was allowed to produce one son. Once that son came of age, she and her son were sent away to a province. She would dedicate her life to raising him, never seeing the sultan again. This rule prevented any single woman from gaining too much power over the sultan's heart. But Hurrem broke the rule. She gave birth to a son, Mehmed. By tradition, she should have packed her bags. But Suleiman did not send her away. He kept her in Istanbul. She gave birth to a second son, then a daughter, then another son. She had done the unthinkable. She had formed a monogamous family unit inside a polygamous institution. The harem was in shock. The joyful one had stopped the rotation of the world. But by rising so high, so fast, she had made powerful enemies. Chief among them was Mahidevran, the mother of the Sultan's eldest son, Mustafa. Mahidevran had been the favorite. She was the mother of the heir, and she watched with growing fury as this Russian slave girl stole the Sultan's gaze, his knights, and his heart. The tension in the tiled corridors grew thick. It was a silent war, fought with glances, whispers, and protocol. But soon it would turn physical, and then it would turn deadly. The harem was a world of silence, but it was a silence filled with noise. The rustle of silk, the whisper of rumors, the beating of hearts in fear. As Hurrem's influence grew, the palace became too small for two queens. On one side stood Mahidevran. She was the rose of spring. She was the mother of the heir, Mustafa. She represented tradition, the old way, the established order. On the other side stood Hurrem, the joyful one, the mother of 4 sons. She represented the new, the disruption, the chaos. Their conflict was not merely a domestic dispute. It was a collision of dynastic futures. If Mahidevran won, Hurrem's sons would die. If Hurrem won, Mahidevran's son would die. The tension festered for years. And then, one afternoon, the dam broke. History records a confrontation. It happened in the corridors of the harem, away from the eyes of the Sultan. Mahidevran, pushed to the breaking point by Hurrem's rising status, lost her composure. She insulted Hurrem, and then she attacked her. It was not a duel of swords, but a frantic, desperate struggle of fingernails and rage. Mahidevran scratched Hurrem's face. She beat her. She screamed that she, Mahidran, was the head of the harem and Harem was merely bought meat.
In that moment of violence, Mahidevran felt she had re-established dominance. But she had made a fatal strategic error. Hurrem did not fight back. She took the blows. She let the blood run down her cheek. She let her clothes be torn.
When the fight was broken up, Hurrem retreated to her room.
Later that evening, the Sultan summoned Hurrem to his bed. This was the moment.
Most women would have rushed to him, weeping, demanding justice. But Hurrem understood the psychology of power better than anyone. She refused to go. She sent a message to the Sultan's chamberlain. She said she could not appear before her lord. She said she was too ashamed of her battered face. She said she was too ugly to be seen by the emperor of the world. Suleiman was confused. Then he was concerned. Then, when he saw her, saw the scratches, the bruises, the evidence of violence done to his beloved, he was enraged. He did not see a fight between two women. He saw an attack on his own authority. He saw the old order trying to crush the new happiness he had found. The consequences were swift.
Suleiman banished Mahidevran to the provinces. He sent her away to live with her son Mustafa. She was removed from the center of power, never to return to the Sultan's side. Hurrem had turned a physical defeat into a total political victory. She was now the undisputed mistress of the harem. But she knew that as long as Mustafa lived, her children were in danger. The game was not over. It was just entering its deadliest phase. With her rival gone, Hurrem aimed for something impossible. She wanted legitimacy. For centuries, Ottoman sultans did not marry. They had concubines. They had children, but they did not take wives. Marriage created legal ties to other families, and the Ottomans wanted their rulers to be beholden to no one. Hurrem convinced Suleiman to break this rule. It happened quietly. There was no public parade. There were no foreign dignitaries invited to gawk. In a private ceremony, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the shadow of God on earth, legally married Hurrem, the former slave from Ruthenia. The news rippled through Istanbul like an earthquake. People couldn't believe it. They whispered that she must have used magic. They said she had bewitched him. How else could a Russian captive become the queen? But it wasn't magic. It was a partnership. Hurrem received a new title, Haseki Sultan. It meant the one who belongs exclusively to the Sultan. She moved out of the harem dormitories and into the Sultan's own quarters. She began to shape the empire. She was no longer just a lover. She was a philanthropist. She was an architect. She commissioned the great architect Sinan. She built the Haseki Sultan complex, a massive hospital, soup kitchen, and school for the women of Istanbul. She wrote letters to the King of Poland, signing them as the Empress. She sent gifts to the Shah of Persia. She had enclosed the Sultan's heart, and in doing so, she had opened the door for women to rule the empire. But there was one final shadow falling over her triumph, a shadow cast by a prince who was loved by the army and who stood between her sons and the throne. The tragedy of Prince Mustafa is the dark heart of Hurrem's story. Mustafa was Suleiman's eldest son. He was handsome. He was brave. The Janissaries, the elite soldiers,
worshipped him. They saw him as the next great conqueror.
To Hurrem, he was death incarnate. If Mustafa became sultan, the law of fratricide would compel him to execute Hurrem's sons, Selim, Bayezid, and Jihangir, to prevent civil war. It was him or them. Hurrem and her son-in-law, the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, began to whisper in Suleiman's ear. Mustafa is too popular. The army loves him more than you. He is growing impatient. He is corresponding with the Shah of Persia. The rumors were like poison. Drop by drop, they filled the Sultan's mind with paranoia. Suleiman was an old man now. He was tired. He feared the fate of his own father, who had been overthrown. In 1553, during a campaign against Persia, the trap was sprung. Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent. The prince was warned. His friends told him not to go. They told him his father was angry. But Mustafa refused to believe that his father would kill him. He was a loyal son. He dressed in white. He rode to the Sultan's camp. The soldiers cheered as he passed. He dismounted. He walked to the great black tent of the Sultan. He stepped inside. He expected to see his father sitting on the throne. Instead, he found the tent empty of furniture. Standing in the shadows were 7 mute executioners. The struggle was brief. It was silent, save for the shuffling of feet on the carpets. A silken bowstring was tightened around the prince's neck. When it was over, they laid his body on a rug outside the tent. Suleiman watched from behind the screen. History tells us he wept, but he did not stop it. The greatest obstacle to Hurrem's power was gone. Her son, Selim, would inherit the empire. She had won, but the victory was cold. It was bought with the blood of a son who had done nothing wrong but be born to the wrong mother. Hurrem Sultan did not live to see her son take the throne. She died in 1558, 8 years before Suleiman. She passed away in the Topkapi Palace, the same place she had entered as a slave girl 50 years before. Suleiman was devastated. He mourned her for the rest of his life. He wrote poetry about his grief, calling her my Istanbul, my Karaman, the earth of my Anatolia. He buried her in a magnificent mausoleum in the garden of the Suleymaniya Mosque. And when he died, he was buried right beside her. Think of that image. The emperor of the world and the slave girl from Ruthenia lying side by side in the eternal dark. She left behind a transformed world. After her, the Sultanate of Women began. For a century, powerful women ruled the empire from the harem, appointing viziers, declaring wars, and building mosques. She had proven that even in a world of iron rules, a single person with enough will could reshape the walls. The quiet earth. And so, we have reached the end of our journey. We have walked a long road tonight. We stood in the freezing mud of a medieval village, watching the fire of the communal oven go cold. We saw the enclosure of the simple things, the bread, the wood, the rain. We marched with the Roman legionaries in the heat of the Judean desert. We felt the weight of their armor and the terrifying mechanical rhythm of their siege engines. We saw them build an iron order on top of the ruins. We sat in the dusty workshops of the guilds.
We watched the apprentice sweep the floor and the master guard his secrets. We saw the brotherhood rise, and we saw it fade into silence when the plague and the market came. And finally, we walked the silk corridors of the Ottoman palace. We watched a captive girl rise from the dust to capture the heart of an emperor and reshape the world. These stories are all different, but they are also the same. They are stories about the human need to control, to enclose, to build walls around the wildness of the world and say, "This is mine." But look at them now. The oven is cold. The stones have returned to the earth. The legion is gone. Their armor has rusted into dust. The boar is just a carving on a buried stone. The Guildhall is silent. The secrets of the masters are forgotten. The Sultan and the Queen are sleeping. Their ambitions are quiet. History is heavy. It is full of struggle. But in the end, everything returns to the silence. And this is the comfort of the past. It is finished. The struggle of the peasant is over. The march of the soldier is over. The anxiety of the merchant is over. And for tonight, your struggle is over too. You do not need to build a wall around this moment. You do not need to tax your thoughts. You do not need to guard your sleep. The enclosure is open. The commons are free again. The night belongs to you. The air is yours. The dark is yours. The quiet is yours. Let the weight of the history drop from your shoulders. Let the dust settle. Let the fire fade to embers. Sleep.